The fishing line sliced through the morning air with a whisper, and Penelope Garrison looked up from her nets just in time to see the hook catch on the very edge of her mending basket, sending dried thread spiraling into Challis Creek. She gasped, her hands instinctively reaching for the basket before it could tumble completely into the water. The year was 1878, and life in Challis, Idaho Territory, had taught her to protect what little she had. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a mining accident up in the hills, and every possession mattered when you were trying to survive on your own. "Oh hell, I am so sorry, madam," called a deep voice from upstream. "I did not see you there behind that willow." Penelope steadied her basket and looked toward the source of the voice. A man emerged from behind the tree line, walking carefully along the rocky creek bank. He wore worn denim trousers and a faded red shirt, his hat pushed back to reveal sun-darkened skin and concerned blue eyes. He appeared to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with strong shoulders and the easy movement of someone comfortable in the wilderness. "You should watch where you cast," she said, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. At 24, she had grown accustomed to the solitary work by the creek, and interruptions were rare this far from town. "These nets are my livelihood. I can see that, and I truly apologize." He reeled in his line quickly, the hook now free of her basket. "Name is Preston Hayes. I am new to Challis, just signed on with the cattle drive that came through last week. Some of the herd is grazing a few miles north while we wait for the mountain pass to clear." Penelope returned her attention to the net in her lap, her fingers finding the familiar rhythm of the mending work. The mesh had torn in several places during the last fishing, and Mr. Chen, who ran the mercantile, paid her decent money for the repairs. "Penelope Garrison. And if you are looking for good fishing, you would do better another mile upstream. The current is stronger there." Preston did not move away as she expected. Instead, he picked his way closer along the bank until he stood about 10 feet from where she sat on her favorite flat rock. "Mrs. Garrison, I assume." "It is widow now, but yes." She kept her eyes on her work, though she felt his gaze on her. She had grown used to the curious looks in town, the way some men saw a young widow as either a tragedy or an opportunity. She preferred to be neither. "I am sorry for your loss." His voice carried genuine sympathy rather than the calculating tone she had learned to recognize. "How long have you been working with the nets?" "About a year. Before that I took in laundry, but the creek work suits me better." She tied off a knot and examined her progress. "Quieter," Preston chuckled softly, "until cowboys come along and tangle your supplies, you mean." Despite herself, Penelope felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly. "Precisely." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. The creek burbled over smooth stones, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a meadowlark sang. Preston remained standing there, his fishing pole held loosely in one hand, and Penelope found herself oddly aware of his presence. She had spent so many mornings alone by the creek that having company felt both intrusive and, surprisingly, not entirely unwelcome. "You mind if I fish from here?" he asked. "I promise to keep my line away from your workspace." Penelope considered him for a long moment. He had an open face, honest somehow, without the hardness she had seen in so many men who drifted through the Idaho Territory. "I suppose the creek does not belong to me. Fish where you like." Preston moved a respectful distance downstream and cast his line with more care this time. The fly landed softly on the water's surface, and he began the patient work of waiting for a bite. Penelope returned to her mending, and for a while they existed in companionable silence, two people making their way in the wilderness, each focused on their own task. "Where did you learn to mend nets?" Preston asked after a time. My father was a fisherman back in Oregon. Before he died, he taught me what he knew. Penelope held up the net to check her work in the sunlight. We moved here when I was 16. My mother wanted to be closer to her sister, but then she passed too, and it was just Thomas and me. That is a lot of loss for someone so young. Penelope shrugged, though the gesture held years of pain she had learned to carry. This land takes what it wants. You learn to keep going or you do not survive. Preston nodded slowly. I lost my parents to cholera when I was 19. Spent the last decade working cattle drives, moving from place to place. Gets lonely after a while. Something in his tone made Penelope look up properly. Preston was watching the creek, his profile thoughtful. He had a strong jaw and weathered hands, and there was a quality to his stillness that spoke of long hours spent in contemplation. She recognized something of herself in that careful quiet, the way a person learned to be alone without falling apart. "Why stop in Challis?" she asked. "Needed a place to rest for a spell. The trail boss says we will be here too, maybe 3 weeks until the pass clears. Gives me time to decide if I want to keep moving or put down roots somewhere." He glanced at her then, and something in his blue eyes made her heart skip unexpectedly. "What about you? Do you plan to stay in Challis?" "Where else would I go? Thomas left me the cabin. It is not much, but it is mine. And the work here is steady enough." Preston reeled in his line and cast again. "A home is nothing to take lightly. I have been sleeping under stars and in bunkhouses so long I almost forgot what it is like to have a place that is truly yours." They fell silent again, but the quiet had shifted somehow, become more substantial. Penelope worked through another section of net, her fingers moving automatically while her mind wandered. She had not had a real conversation with anyone in weeks. The people in Challis were kind enough, but there was always a distance, a reminder that she existed on the margins as a widow without family. This stranger by the creek asked questions like he genuinely wanted to know the answers. The sun reached its peak, and Penelope felt her stomach remind her that she had eaten only a small breakfast before dawn. She began gathering her supplies, rolling the mended net carefully into her basket. "Heading back to town?" Preston asked. "To my cabin, yes. It is about a mile that way." She pointed east toward the tree line. "I need to return this net to Mr. Chen before evening." Preston hesitated, then reeled in his line completely. "Would you mind if I walked with you part of the way? I should be getting back to camp myself." Penelope considered refusing. The sensible part of her, the part that had learned to protect herself, suggested that accepting company from a stranger was unwise. But another part, a part she had thought Thomas took with him into the grave, felt curious about this cowboy with the careful cast and the honest eyes. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said finally. They walked along the creek bank together, following the narrow path that wound through the willows and cottonwoods. Preston carried his fishing pole over one shoulder, and Penelope kept her basket close. The spring growth was lush around them, wildflowers dotting the grass in splashes of purple and yellow. A breeze carried the scent of pine from the mountains. "You fish just for yourself, or are you feeding the whole camp?" Penelope asked. "Bit of both. Cookie always appreciates fresh catch, and it gives me something to do besides play cards and listen to the boys argue about everything under the sun." Preston smiled. "Though I did not catch anything today, so I suppose I will hear about that too. You picked a poor spot. The fish know to avoid that bend in the creek. And here I thought I was being clever, finding somewhere quiet." He glanced at her with humor in his eyes. "Though I suppose I still found something worthwhile." Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks and focused on the path ahead. It had been so long since a man had looked at her that way, with interest and something like appreciation. Thomas had been a good husband, steady and kind, but theirs had been a practical marriage born of shared loneliness. She had cared for him deeply, but the spark of attraction was something she had only read about in the occasional novel that passed through town. "You should try the deeper pool near the old beaver dam," she said, keeping her voice steady. "If you are planning to fish again tomorrow." "I might do that. Will you be mending nets again?" "Most likely. I have 3 more to finish before the end of the week. Then perhaps I will see you there." They reached a fork in the path where Penelope would turn toward town and Preston would head north to the cattle camp. He stopped and adjusted his hat, his expression suddenly uncertain in a way that made him seem younger. "Mrs. Garrison, I know I am just passing through, but I enjoyed talking with you this morning. Would it be inappropriate if I came by the creek again? Just to fish and maybe share some conversation?" Penelope should have said no. The proper thing, the safe thing, would be to thank him politely and send him on his way. But she found herself thinking about the long, silent mornings ahead, the endless repetition of her solitary routine. What harm could there be in a little company, especially from someone who would be gone in a few weeks anyway? "The creek is open to everyone," she said carefully. "If you happen to be fishing when I happen to be working, I suppose that is just coincidence." Preston's face brightened. "Coincidence?" "Yes, I understand completely." They parted ways, and Penelope found herself walking faster than usual, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply unused to attention. But that evening, as she delivered the mended net and returned to her small cabin, she caught herself wondering if Preston Hayes would really come back to the creek, and whether she wanted him to. The next morning arrived cool and misty, the kind of dawn that made everything seem softer and more distant. Penelope woke early as always, dressed in her practical work dress, and gathered her supplies. She told herself she was not hoping for anything as she made her way to the creek, that her routine was unchanged. But she had taken extra care with her hair, pinning it more neatly than usual, and she had chosen her newer dress instead of the truly worn one. When she reached her favorite spot by the creek, Preston was already there, standing in the shallows with his line in the water. He looked up as she approached, and his face broke into a genuine smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Garrison. Fancy meeting you here." "Purely coincidental, I am sure," she replied, but she could not quite suppress her own smile. She settled onto her rock and pulled out the next net, and Preston returned to his fishing. But this time, the silence felt different, charged with an awareness that had not been there before. Within minutes, they were talking again, sharing stories about their lives with an ease that surprised them both. Preston told her about growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the way his mother sang while she cooked, and his father's booming laugh. He spoke of the hard years after they died, drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place that felt like home. Penelope found herself opening up in return, describing her childhood in Oregon, the fishing boats and the ocean smell, her father's patient teaching. She talked about Thomas, about their quiet life together, the way he had been kind but distant, always more interested in his mining claims than in building a real partnership. She had been lonely even before he died, she admitted, though saying it aloud made her feel guilty. "Loneliness is not about being alone," Preston said quietly. "Sometimes you can be loneliest right next to someone." "Yes," Penelope breathed. "Yes, exactly that." The days began to form a pattern. Each morning, Penelope would arrive at the creek to find Preston already there, or he would appear shortly after, always with some playful comment about coincidence. They would work side by side, talking about everything and nothing. Preston proved to be surprisingly easy to talk to. with a way of listening that made Penelope feel heard, truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her life. He told her about the cattle drives, the months spent moving thousands of animals across harsh terrain, the camaraderie of the cowboys and the beauty of the open range. She described the rhythms of Challis, the way the seasons turned in the mountains, the small dramas of town life. They discovered shared loves of thunderstorms and early mornings, of strong coffee and the sound of moving water. On the fourth day, Preston finally caught a fish, a beautiful rainbow trout that jumped and fought on his line. Penelope set aside her net to watch, laughing as he struggled to reel it in, eventually landing it on the bank with a triumphant shout. He held it up like a trophy, grinning like a boy, and something shifted in Penelope's chest, a wall she had built around her heart developing its first crack. "I knew this spot would produce," he declared. "You picked the worst spot in the creek," she reminded him, "but I suppose even the worst spot gives up a fish eventually. Are you suggesting I am merely lucky? I am suggesting the fish took pity on you." Preston laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the creek valley. "Well, lucky or pitied, I finally have something to bring back to camp. Cookie will be relieved." He cleaned the fish efficiently and they continued their morning, but something had changed. The laughter had brought them closer somehow, made the air between them feel more intimate. Penelope found herself watching Preston when he was not looking, noticing the way his hands moved with practiced skill, the strength in his shoulders, the kindness in his eyes. A week passed, then another. The cattle camp remained north of town, waiting for the mountain pass to fully clear. Preston came to the creek every morning, and Penelope found herself looking forward to dawn in a way she never had before. She would wake with a sense of anticipation, her heart lighter as she prepared for the day. They began to share meals sometimes, simple affairs of bread and cheese that Penelope brought from town, or fish that Preston caught and cooked over a small fire. They sat together on the creek bank, shoulders not quite touching but close enough that Penelope could feel the warmth of him. She had not been this close to a man since Thomas died, and the awareness made her nervous and excited in equal measure. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," Preston said one afternoon, after they had eaten and were sitting in comfortable silence. Penelope considered the question. "I wanted to see the ocean again before I died. My father used to say it was the most beautiful thing in the world, the way it stretched on forever. Sometimes I dream about it, and when I wake up in Challis, I feel sad for a moment before I remember where I am." Preston nodded slowly. "I want to build something that lasts, a ranch maybe, or a home. I am tired of everything being temporary. I want to put down roots so deep nothing could pull them up." "Those are good dreams," Penelope said softly. "They are. Though lately I have been thinking they might be better with someone to share them." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Penelope felt the full weight of his meaning. Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. The creek burbled beside them, and somewhere a bird called, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. "Preston," she started, then stopped, unsure what to say. "I know I have only been here a short while," he said, "and I know you have been through loss. But Penelope, these mornings with you have been the best part of every day. You make me want to stop drifting. You make me want to stay." Penelope stood abruptly, her heart pounding. This was too much, too fast. She had been content with their easy friendship, had told herself it was just temporary company that meant nothing. But the truth was pressing in on her now, undeniable. She cared for this cowboy, more than cared for him, and that terrified her. "I should get back to town," she said, gathering her supplies with shaking hands. "Mr. Chen will be expecting these nets." Preston rose too, his face troubled. "Penelope, wait. I am sorry if I spoke out of turn." "You did not. That is the problem." She met his eyes and saw her own confusion and longing reflected back. I cannot do this, Preston. I cannot let myself feel this way. You will leave when the past clears. Everyone leaves. What if I did not want to leave? Do not say things you do not mean. I mean every word. He stepped closer and Penelope forced herself not to retreat. I know it is fast. I know it seems impossible. But I have spent 10 years wandering, and I never felt like I belonged anywhere until I sat by this creek with you. That has to mean something. Penelope wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly her chest ached. But belief required trust, and trust required risk, and she had already lost so much. What if she opened her heart only to have him leave anyway? What if she let herself love him and then had to survive his loss too? I need time, she whispered. Please, Preston, I need to think. He nodded, though disappointment shadowed his features. Of course. I will not push, but Penelope, I will be here tomorrow morning and the morning after that, for as long as you need. She fled then, walking quickly down the path toward town, her basket clutched tightly. Behind her, she heard Preston call her name once, but she did not turn back. She could not. If she looked at him again, she might do something foolish like run into his arms, and she could not afford to be that vulnerable. That evening, Penelope sat in her cabin and tried to understand what she was feeling. The small house felt emptier than usual, the silence oppressive rather than peaceful. She moved through her routine mechanically, heating soup for dinner, mending a tear in her spare dress, reading by candlelight until her eyes grew tired. But her mind kept returning to the creek, to Preston's words, to the way he looked at her like she was something precious. She had not felt precious in a very long time. The next morning, she almost did not go to the creek. She lay in bed as dawn broke, arguing with herself. The safe choice would be to stay away, to let Preston fish alone until the cattle drive moved on. In a few weeks, he would be gone, and her life would return to its quiet routine. She could protect herself from more hurt. But even as she thought it, Penelope knew she was lying to herself. The hurt would come either way. If she hid now, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. At least if she was brave enough to try, she would know. She dressed and gathered her supplies, and her feet carried her to the creek as they had every morning for the past 2 weeks. Preston was there, as he had promised, standing in his usual spot with his fishing line in the water. When he saw her, relief and joy flooded his face in equal measure. "You came," he said simply. "I almost did not," Penelope admitted. She set down her basket but did not immediately start working. "Preston, I am afraid. I am afraid of caring about you and then losing you. I am afraid of being alone again." He set down his fishing pole and came to her, stopping just inches away. "I am afraid too. I am afraid of staying and having you decide you do not want me. I am afraid I am not good enough for you, but I would rather be afraid with you than safe without you." Penelope looked up at him, at this man who had somehow become essential to her in such a short time. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he was offering her. And she made a choice. She chose to be brave. "I care about you," she said, her voice trembling. "I did not want to, I tried not to, but these mornings with you, they have made me remember what it feels like to be happy. You make me want to hope again." Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he cupped her face gently in his hands. "Then hope with me, Penelope. Let me stay. Let me prove that I mean what I say. What about the cattle drive? I will tell the trail boss I am done. I have enough saved to last a while, and there is always work for a man willing to do it. I will find something in Challis. I will build us a life here if you will let me. You would give up the trail for me. I would give up the trail for the chance to wake up next to you every morning. For the chance to build something real and lasting with you, if you will have me." Penelope felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I will have you," she whispered. "I will have you, Preston Hayes, if you truly mean to stay." He smiled then, brilliant and joyous, and pulled her into his arms. Penelope went willingly, letting herself be held for the first time in years. Preston was solid and warm, and she could hear his heart beating fast beneath her ear. She wrapped her arms around him and held on tight, letting herself believe that this could be real, that she could have this. When he kissed her, it was soft and sweet and full of promise. Penelope kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and longing into it. The creek sang beside them, and the morning sun warmed their faces, and for the first time since Thomas died, Penelope felt like she might have a future worth living. They spent the rest of the morning wrapped in each other, talking about possibilities and dreams. Preston would leave the cattle drive and find work in Challis. There were always ranches that needed hands, and with his experience, he would have no trouble finding a position. They would court properly, he insisted, do things right. He wanted to marry her, but he wanted to earn that right, wanted the town to see that he was serious about making a life here. Penelope agreed, though part of her wanted to skip all the formalities and just start their life together immediately. But Preston was right. Challis was a small town and people talked. If they wanted to build a life here, they needed to do it respectfully. Over the following weeks, Preston made good on every promise. He left the cattle drive, and true to his word, found work at the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles from town. The owner, a gruff man named Mr. Patterson, appreciated Preston's experience and hired him on the spot. Preston found a room in the boarding house in Challis and began the work of establishing himself in the community. He courted Penelope with old-fashioned dedication. He came calling at her cabin in the evenings, always bringing something small, a handful of wildflowers, a pretty stone from the creek, once a book of poetry he had traded for in town. They would sit on her porch and talk until the stars came out, and then Preston would tip his hat and walk back to town, always the gentleman. The people of Challis watched the courtship with interest. Penelope had been a fixture in town for years, the quiet widow who kept to herself, and Preston was the newcomer who had chosen to stay. Mr. Chen approved, telling Penelope that Preston had good character, that he had seen the way the cowboy looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore from the dress shop agreed, saying it was high time Penelope had some happiness in her life. Not everyone was kind. There were whispers that it was too soon, that Penelope should still be in mourning. Some questioned Preston's motives, suggested he was after whatever small savings Thomas had left behind. But the gossip faded as weeks turned to months and Preston's commitment became undeniable. He worked hard at the ranch, earned the respect of the other hands, and never wavered in his devotion to Penelope. They still met at the creek most mornings before Preston had to leave for the ranch. It had become their place, sacred in a way neither quite spoke aloud. Penelope would mend nets and Preston would fish, and they would talk about their days and their hopes. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, content to be near each other. 3 months after that first morning when Preston's fishing line had caught her basket, he proposed properly. He took Penelope on a picnic up into the foothills, spreading a blanket in a meadow filled with wildflowers. They ate sandwiches and drank cool water from a canteen, and when the meal was done, Preston took both her hands in his. "Penelope Garrison, you are the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe in home again. You made me believe in love. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" He pulled out a simple gold band, scratched and worn but precious. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing I have left of her. I would be honored if you would wear it." Penelope looked at the ring, at Preston's hopeful face, and felt her last defenses crumble. "Yes," she said, laughing through happy tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Hayes. I will marry you and spend the rest of my life being grateful that you caught my basket that morning." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her thoroughly, and Penelope kissed him back with all the love she had been holding inside. They lay back on the blanket and stared at the sky, hands clasped, and planned their future together. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Challis. It was a simple ceremony, attended by what felt like the whole town. Mr. Chen stood as Preston's witness, and Mrs. Whitmore stood for Penelope. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together, and Penelope felt the truth of every word in her bones. When Preston said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to love you every day of my life. I promise to be your partner and your friend. I promise to make you laugh and hold you when you cry. I promise to build a home with you that will stand against anything." Penelope spoke her own vows with equal conviction. "I promise to trust you with my heart. I promise to be brave with you. I promise to love you in the quiet moments and the hard ones. I promise to make a life with you that honors both our pasts and builds toward our future." They sealed their promises with a kiss, and the church erupted in applause. There was a reception afterward at the town hall, with food and music and dancing. Preston spun Penelope around the floor until she was dizzy and laughing, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Penelope felt pure, uncomplicated joy. That night, Preston carried her over the threshold of her cabin, which was now their cabin. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with such love that Penelope felt tears prick her eyes again. "I am going to spend every day trying to make you as happy as I am right now," he promised. "You already do," Penelope whispered. "You already do." They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other with patience and tenderness. Preston was gentle and attentive, and Penelope let herself be vulnerable in a way she never had been before. This was different from her marriage to Thomas. This was built on passion and connection, on a love that had grown from genuine friendship and deep respect. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Preston stroked Penelope's hair while she traced patterns on his chest. "Tell me something," she murmured. "Did you really come to that spot on the creek by accident that first morning?" Preston chuckled. "Well, I might have heard from one of the ranch hands that a pretty widow did net mending by Challis Creek, and I might have been curious enough to go looking for her. But the fishing line catching your basket, that was pure accident. I really am that poor of a fisherman." Penelope laughed and swatted his chest. "You deceived me. I got your attention, did I not? You got much more than my attention, Preston Hayes." "Good," he said, kissing the top of her head, "because you have all of mine, Penelope Hayes, Penelope Hayes." She tested the name silently and found she loved it. She was no longer the lonely widow by the creek. She was a wife again, but more than that, she was a partner in something real and true. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight, as it always was in the Idaho Territory, and they had to be careful with every dollar. The cabin was small for 2 people, and they sometimes got on each other's nerves in the way that people do when they are learning to share space. Preston's work at the double bar was demanding, with long hours and hard labor, and he often came home exhausted. But they worked through every challenge together. When money was short, they found creative ways to stretch their resources, with Penelope taking on extra mending work and Preston hunting to supplement their food supplies. When the cabin felt cramped, they spent their evenings on the porch, talking under the stars. When Preston was exhausted, Penelope would rub his sore shoulders and draw him a hot bath. And when Penelope was overwhelmed with the endless domestic tasks, Preston would help with the washing or the cooking without being asked. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, figured out how to communicate and compromise. Preston discovered that Penelope liked to be left alone for the first hour after waking, while she learned that Preston needed physical affection, small touches throughout the day to feel connected. They had their first real fight about 3 months into the marriage, over something ridiculous that neither could quite remember later, but they learned how to argue fairly and forgive completely. Through it all, their love deepened. What had started as attraction and hope matured into something solid and enduring. Preston kept his promises, showing up every single day with the same devotion he had offered from the beginning. Penelope learned to trust completely, to believe that he would not leave, that this was real and permanent. They still went to the creek together on Sunday mornings, their one day off. It remained their special place, and they would sit on the bank and talk about their week, their dreams, the small details of their life together. Preston taught Penelope to fish properly, and she taught him the finer points of net mending. They laughed about that first morning, how Preston's wayward hook had changed both their lives completely. A year and a half into their marriage, Penelope realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was sure. One evening, after Preston came home from the ranch, she pulled him down to sit beside her on their small sofa. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hands. "We are going to have a baby." Preston's face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, pure elation. "A baby." "Truly, truly. I think I am about 3 months along. The baby should come in late winter." Preston let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "We are going to be parents. Penelope, we are going to have a family." She laughed against his chest, feeling his joy add to her own. "We are. Are you ready for this?" "I have been ready since the day I met you," he said. "I cannot wait to meet our child. I cannot wait to build this life with you, to watch our family grow." The pregnancy was harder than Penelope expected. She was sick for the first few months and exhausted all the time. Preston took over more of the household tasks, cooking and cleaning when he got home from the ranch, despite his own tiredness. He was endlessly patient with her mood swings and worries, holding her when she cried over small things and laughing with her when the baby kicked for the first time. As winter approached, Preston began preparing the cabin for the baby. He built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until it was soft as silk. He reinforced the walls to keep out drafts and stocked extra firewood. Penelope sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing as best she could for the new life that would soon join them. On a frigid night in January 1880, Penelope went into labor. Preston fetched Mrs. Whitmore, who had experience with births, and then spent the longest hours of his life pacing outside the bedroom, listening to Penelope's labored breathing and occasional cries. He wanted to be with her to help somehow, but Mrs. Whitmore had shooed him out, saying he would only be in the way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard a new sound: the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Hayes, a healthy, loud son, and your wife is doing well." Preston rushed into the bedroom to find Penelope propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. Preston approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a red, wrinkled face and a shock of dark hair. His eyes were squeezed shut, and his small fists waved in the air. He was the most beautiful thing Preston had ever seen, except for the woman holding him. "Would you like to hold him?" Penelope asked softly. Preston nodded, not trusting his voice, and carefully took the baby into his arms. His son was so small, so fragile, and Preston felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle. This little person would depend on him for everything. He and Penelope would shape this life, guide it, protect it. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. What should we name him? Penelope asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on one, wanting to wait until they met their child. Preston looked down at his son, at the small face that was already so dear to him. "Samuel," he said. "After your father, Samuel Hayes." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel." "Yes, that is perfect." The first weeks with Samuel were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Preston did what he could, changing diapers and walking with the baby when he cried, but most of the work fell to Penelope. She was exhausted but happy, spending her days nursing and rocking and marveling at the tiny person they had created. Preston returned to work at the ranch after a week, reluctant to leave but needing the income. He rushed home every evening, eager to see his wife and son, to hold Samuel and give Penelope a break. They fell into a new rhythm, their life expanding to accommodate this small but demanding presence. As Samuel grew, he brought new dimensions of joy to their lives. His first smile, directed at Preston as his father made silly faces, made them both laugh with delight. His first laugh, bubbling up when Penelope tickled his belly, was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Every milestone, every new development felt like a miracle. When Samuel was about 6 months old, Preston came home one evening with news. "Mr. Patterson is looking to sell part of his land," he said. "About 40 acres on the eastern edge of the property near the creek. He is willing to offer it to me at a good price, payments over time." Penelope looked up from where she was nursing Samuel. Our own land," Preston confirmed. "We could build a real house, Penelope. Something bigger than this cabin with room for our family to grow. We could have a few head of cattle, maybe some chickens. Start building something that is really ours." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. They had been saving carefully, but a land purchase was a major commitment. Still, Penelope could see the hope in Preston's eyes, the way this represented everything he had dreamed of. "Let us do it," she said. "Let us build our future." Preston grinned and pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of the baby between them. "I am going to give you the best life, Penelope Hayes. I promise you that." They purchased the land, signing papers that made them property owners for the first time. It took Preston nearly 2 years to build the house, working weekends and evenings, sometimes with help from other ranch hands. It was a simple structure, but solid, with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. When it was finally finished, they moved in on a bright spring day, Samuel toddling around excitedly in the new space. Penelope walked through each room, touching the walls Preston had built with his own hands, and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This was home. This was the future they had built together, brick by brick, from nothing more than a chance meeting by a creek. Life on their small ranch was good. Preston still worked at the double bar, but now he came home to his own land, his own house. They acquired a few cattle and built a small chicken coop. Penelope kept a large garden and continued her net mending, though less frequently now that she was busy with Samuel and the ranch. They were not wealthy, but they had enough. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He loved the ranch, trailing after Preston whenever he could, trying to help with the chores. Preston was a patient, loving father, teaching his son about animals and land management, about being a good man. Penelope watched them together, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life they had built. When Samuel was 3, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and on a warm summer evening in 1883, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Preston's mother. Rose was a calm baby, easier than Samuel had been, with a sweet temperament and a ready smile. Their family felt complete. Preston would come home from work to find Penelope in the kitchen, Rose on her hip while Samuel chattered about his day. They would eat dinner together, then Preston would play with the children while Penelope cleaned up. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, Samuel running around the yard while Preston held Rose and Penelope sat close beside him. "Did you ever imagine this?" Penelope asked one evening, leaning her head on Preston's shoulder. "When you were drifting from place to place, did you imagine you could have something like this?" "I imagined it," Preston said, kissing her hair. "But I never quite believed it was possible. Not until I cast that fishing line and accidentally caught your attention," Penelope laughed. "Best bad cast you ever made. The only good thing that ever came from my terrible fishing skills." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Samuel chase fireflies. Rose dozed in Preston's arms, and somewhere an owl called. The creek burbled in the distance, a constant soundtrack to their lives. "I love you," Penelope said softly. "I love you so much it still surprises me sometimes. I never thought I could feel this way." "I love you too," Preston replied. "Every day more than the day before. You gave me everything, Penelope. A home, a family, a reason to stay in one place. You saved me from a lifetime of wandering." "You saved me too," she said. "From loneliness, from thinking I would spend the rest of my life just surviving. You taught me I could be happy again." Years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Samuel grew tall and strong, eventually becoming a real help on the ranch. Rose grew into a thoughtful, kind child who loved to read and draw. Preston and Penelope watched their children flourish, guiding them with patient love. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. They added to their herd, built a proper barn, expanded the house to give the children their own rooms. Preston's reputation as a skilled rancher grew, and he occasionally took on extra work helping neighbors. Penelope's garden produced abundantly, and she began selling vegetables in town, adding to their income. Their love continued to deepen and mature. They had weathered disagreements and hardships, times when money was impossibly tight or when illness swept through. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, supporting each other, choosing each other every day. Preston still brought Penelope wildflowers, and she still made his favorite meals. They still found time to sit together in the evenings, talking about their day, their dreams, the thousand small details of a life shared. When Samuel was 12 and Rose was 9, Preston surprised Penelope with a trip. He had been planning it for months, saving in secret, and in the early summer he presented her with train tickets. "Where are we going?" she asked, confused. "To the Oregon coast," he said, grinning. "You told me once that you wanted to see the ocean again." "I thought it was time we made that happen." Penelope stared at him, overwhelmed. "Preston, we cannot afford this. I have been putting aside a little bit each month for 2 years. We can afford it, and Samuel is old enough to help Mr. Patterson for a week, and Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to stay with the children. Everything is arranged." Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks. "You remembered. After all these years, you remembered." "I remember everything you have ever told me," Preston said, wiping away her tears. "Every dream, every hope. This one I could make happen, so I did." The trip was magical. They traveled by train across the mountains and through the valleys, seeing landscapes they had only heard about. When they finally reached the coast, and Penelope saw the ocean stretching to the horizon, she wept openly. Preston held her as she stood on the beach, feeling the spray on her face, listening to the waves crash. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for making my dream come true." "Anything for you," Preston said simply. "Always." They spent a week there, walking on the beach, eating fresh seafood, simply being together away from the responsibilities of the ranch. It was a second honeymoon in many ways, a chance to reconnect and remember why they had fallen in love in the first place. They returned to Challis refreshed and even more committed to their life together. The children continued to grow. Samuel developed a talent for working with horses and began training them, earning extra money that he saved carefully. Rose discovered a love of teaching and began helping younger children in town with their lessons. Preston and Penelope watched with pride as their children became good, capable people. When Samuel was 18, he announced he wanted to expand the ranch, try breeding better cattle. Preston listened to his son's plans and saw his own younger self, full of dreams and determination. Together, father and son worked to make it happen, expanding their operation, building their legacy. Rose, at 15, was courted by the schoolteacher's son, a young man named Daniel who treated her with respect and obvious adoration. Preston was protective but fair, seeing that Daniel genuinely cared for his daughter. Penelope watched the courtship with maternal concern and remembered her own journey to love. "She is so young," Penelope fretted one evening. "She is older than you were when you married Thomas," Preston pointed out gently. "I know, but I want her to be sure. I want her to have what we have." "Then we trust that we raised her right. We trust that she knows her own heart." Preston pulled Penelope close. "And we are here for her, whatever she decides." Rose and Daniel became engaged when she turned 18, planning a wedding for the following summer. The courtship had been long and careful, and by the time they married, both families felt confident in the match. The wedding was held at the ranch, under the cottonwoods by the creek where Preston and Penelope's story had begun. Samuel met a woman named Catherine the following year, the daughter of a rancher from the next county. Their courtship was swift but sure, and they married within 6 months. Samuel built a house on the eastern part of the property, and he and Catherine began their own life while still working closely with Preston on the ranch. Preston and Penelope found themselves entering a new phase of life. Their children were grown and married, starting families of their own. The ranch was successful and stable. They were in their early 40s, still healthy and active, but beginning to think about their legacy, what they would leave behind. "We built something good," Preston said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set as they had done thousands of times before. "Something that will last." "We did," Penelope agreed. "Our children are happy. The ranch is thriving. We have a real home." "Do you have any regrets?" Preston asked. Penelope considered the question carefully. "Only that I wasted so many years being afraid. If I could go back, I would tell my younger self to be braver sooner. But no, I do not regret the life we built. I would not change a single thing about our journey together." Preston took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after so many years together. "I was thinking, maybe we should make another trip to the coast, just the two of us. We could go for our 20th wedding anniversary next year." "I would love that," Penelope said, squeezing his hand. "Though honestly, Preston, I am happy anywhere as long as you are there. Even by a creek mending nets," she laughed. "Especially by a creek mending nets. That is where everything began after all." The grandchildren started arriving. Rose gave birth to a daughter, then a son. Samuel and Catherine had twin girls. The ranch that had once been quiet echoed with the laughter of children again. Preston proved to be a devoted grandfather, teaching the grandchildren to ride and fish, filling their heads with stories. Penelope made cookies and mended scraped knees, and passed on the skills her own father had taught her so long ago. Life was full and rich. There were still challenges, of course. Harsh winters, dry summers, the ever-present financial pressures of ranching. But Preston and Penelope faced everything together, their partnership strengthened by decades of practice. They knew each other completely, could communicate with a glance, finished each other's sentences without thinking. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they did return to the Oregon coast, recreating that magical week from years before. They walked the same beaches, older now but still in love, still finding joy in each other's company. 20 years, Preston marveled as they stood watching the sunset over the ocean. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. 20 years since you caught my basket with your terrible fishing skills, Penelope teased. Best catch I ever made, even if I was not actually aiming for it. Penelope leaned into him and Preston wrapped his arms around her. Do you know what I love most about our story? She asked. It was not love at first sight. We built this, piece by piece, day by day. We chose each other and kept choosing each other. And I will keep choosing you, Preston said. Every day for the rest of my life. More years passed. The children's families grew. The ranch expanded. Preston's hair turned gray and Penelope's face gained lines, but they wore their age comfortably, like old friends. They had given up the hardest physical labor, letting Samuel and his sons handle most of the ranch work, but they stayed active and involved. They still went to the creek sometimes, on quiet mornings when they could steal away. Penelope would bring mending, though not nets anymore, and Preston would bring his fishing pole. They would sit in their old spots and talk or not talk, simply being together in the place where their story had begun. I hope when we are gone, the children keep this place special, Penelope said one morning, watching the water flow past. I hope they remember that this is where we found each other. They will, Preston assured her. We have told the story enough times. Every grandchild knows about the widow mending nets and the cowboy who could not cast straight. Your casting has not improved much over the years. And yet I caught the only thing that ever mattered. They were well into their 60s when Preston's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had worked hard for decades. He tired more easily, his joints ached. But he remained cheerful, refusing to slow down more than necessary. I am not done yet, he would say when Penelope fussed over him. I still have years of loving you ahead of me, and he did. They had another decade together, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing the first great-grandchild born. The ranch remained in the family, a testament to everything they had built. Their children and grandchildren cared for them as they aged, but Preston and Penelope remained in their beloved house, in the home Preston had built with his own hands. On a warm summer evening, sitting on their porch with Penelope's hand in his, Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 74 years old, and he had spent 37 years married to the woman he loved more than anything in the world. Penelope grieved deeply, but not as she had when Thomas died. That had been the grief of loneliness and fear. This was the grief of having lost something precious, but with the knowledge that she had been blessed beyond measure. She had had decades with a man who loved her completely, who had given her a beautiful family and a life full of joy. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sharp-minded and capable. She spent her days gardening and cooking, telling stories about Preston, passing on the lessons of their life together. She made sure the younger generations understood the value of choosing love every day, of building something lasting through dedication and patience. On a spring morning, Penelope walked down to the creek one last time. She sat on the rock where she had been mending nets that long ago morning when a cowboy cast his line and changed her life forever. The water flowed past as it always had, constant and eternal. "I am ready," she said softly, to Preston or to the universe or to herself. "I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. I am ready to find you again." She passed away in her sleep that night, peaceful and content. She was 71 years old. Her children buried her next to Preston under the cottonwoods by the creek, where they could rest together in the place their story had begun. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's management and eventually passed to his children. The house Preston built stood strong, sheltering generation after generation. The creek continued to flow, eternal and unchanging, a reminder of where it all started. On quiet mornings when the mist hung over the water and the birds were just beginning to sing, the family would sometimes see two figures by the creek. An older couple, sitting close together, content in each other's presence. Whether it was a trick of the light or something more, no one could say for certain. But the story of the widow and the cowboy lived on, passed down through the generations as a testament to the power of love, patience, and choosing to be brave enough to open your heart again. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually stand by that same creek, over 100 years after that fateful morning, and hear the story of how a terrible cast changed two lives forever. They would learn that love could find you in unexpected places, that it was never too late to start again, that building something lasting required daily choice and commitment. And sometimes, on still mornings when the creek ran quiet, you could almost hear laughter echoing through the cottonwoods, as if somewhere in some way, Preston and Penelope were still there, still choosing each other, still living out the beautiful life they had built together, one day at a time. The legacy they left was not measured in land or money, though there was enough of both. It was measured in the love they had shared, the family they had raised, the example they had set. It was measured in the way their children treated their spouses, with respect and devotion. In the way their grandchildren understood the value of commitment. In the way their great-grandchildren knew that love was something you built and maintained, not something that simply happened to you. The creek continued to flow through the property, and the family made sure to protect it, keep it clean and clear. They built a small bench near Penelope's old mending spot with a plaque that read, "Here, two hearts found their home." It became a place of proposal for family members, a spot where couples would go to remember what love looked like when it was done right. Samuel, before he passed, wrote down the full story as his mother had told it to him. He recorded every detail he could remember, from that first morning when Preston's line caught the basket, to their wedding, to the building of the house, to the decades of partnership that followed. He made sure each of his children had a copy, and each of them did the same for their children. The story became a touchstone, a family legend that was nevertheless completely true. When younger generations struggled in their relationships, the elders would remind them of Preston and Penelope. "They chose each other every day," they would say. "Love is not just a feeling. It is a decision you make over and over again." The values that Preston and Penelope had lived by, honesty, hard work, patience, kindness, perseverance, were woven into the fabric of the family they had created. Their influence extended far beyond their own lifetimes, shaping the characters of people who would never meet them but who benefited from the foundation they had laid. And so, in the end, the widow who had been mending nets by the creek had found more than love. She had found partnership and family and purpose. She had found a life that honored both her losses and her joys. And the cowboy who had cast his line so poorly that fateful morning had found more than a catch. He had found home and belonging, and a love that would echo through generations. Their story was one of hope and second chances, of bravery and trust. It proved that it was never too late to begin again, that love could find you when you least expected it, and that the best things in life were built slowly, with care and dedication, day by ordinary day. It was a story of the American West, of hardship and beauty, of building something from nothing through sheer determination and faith. But most of all, it was a love story. Simple and profound, quiet and powerful. The kind of love that changes not just two lives but countless lives that follow. The kind of love that proves the best things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth choosing every single day. And that legacy, that testament to enduring love and partnership, was the greatest gift Preston and Penelope could have left behind. Not just to their family, but to anyone who heard their story and believed, even for a moment, that such love was possible. That somewhere, there might be someone waiting by a creek. That sometimes the worst cast can lead to the best catch. That love, real love, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of uncertainty. Their story proved that happily ever after was not a fairy tale. It was a choice, a daily commitment, a partnership built on respect and maintained through dedication. It was messy and hard and absolutely worth it. It was mornings by a creek and evenings on a porch. It was building a home with your own hands and filling it with laughter. It was choosing to be brave when you wanted to be safe, and finding that courage rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. And in Challis, Idaho territory, now long since a state, the creek still runs clear and cold through what became Hayes Ranch. The cottonwoods still shade the banks. And on quiet mornings, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of a love story that began with a simple accident and grew into something eternal. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them, in the most ordinary of places, through the most unlikely of chances. Preston and Penelope Hayes had built their forever by the creek, and their forever, it turned out, extended far beyond their own lifetimes. It lived on in the land they had loved, the family they had raised, and the story that would be told for generations to come. A story that began with a widow mending nets and a cowboy who caught so much more than fish that day. He caught a heart, and in return, gave his own completely.